Who are you and what are you really like? Well, I can tell you one thing, that the greatest way to know who someone really is to watch them inside the walls of their home. Because when the door is shut and the curtains are pulled, who I am in relationship to my wife and my children really comes out. That's hard to think about because some of the worst things that we may do with people are the ways that we treat our wife or our husband or the ways that we treat our children. And if that's so, then it's true that revival, this work of God in our hearts that would make us look more like Christ and walk more closely with Christ, first of all, it has to begin in my home, in my heart. It begins in me. But then the next place where that revival should go is in my relationship with my husband or wife. If I'm married, my relationship with my mate. One pastor I know had been praying that God would send revival to his church and to the region of the country in which he lived for 17 years. He'd had prayer meetings about revival and he'd talked about it and he'd preached about it. And then when a team came to his church and God began to move in revival, the first place where that happened was in this pastor's heart. And he realized that he didn't love his wife like God tells him to love his wife. He needed revival right there in the walls of his home. He confessed that to his wife. He asked for her forgiveness. He walked through all the things that he had done to her for many, many years that were not like Christ at all. He asked the Spirit of God to take full control of his life and how he treated his wife, and a change began to occur in their home. He later stood up before his church and he said, you know what? I've been praying for great revival to come to our city and to my church for 17 years, but I was stopping that revival by the way I treated my wife. I was aborting revival by the way that I did not love my wife like Christ loved the church. So we need to be clear about this. That revival begins at home. And first of all, if I'm a married person, it starts right in my own heart and my own life. What could this mean for me? Well, here's a very practical suggestion. If you want to get right with the Lord, is to sit down and take a piece of paper and put a number 1 and say, Lord, show me anything in my life that's not pleasing to you, and particularly anything in my home. You might be surprised at how quickly God brings things to your mind. And then the humility to go to your wife and clear your conscience. You know, the Bible says if you're presenting your offering at the altar and you want to have a great time of worship, but realize that you've sinned against your brother, you need to get up from the altar and go clear your conscience and get things right with your brother. In this case, we could say, get right with your wife. Get right with your husband. Are there things between the two of you that have never been resolved? Have you humbled yourself before your husband or your wife and asked for their forgiveness? And then ask the Lord how to correct those things in your behavior in the coming days. If you'll ask God to bring revival to your home, you know what? He'll hear and answer that prayer. But it begins with you. And that's where real revival always starts, in my heart and then in my home.